Switzerland is one of the strangest countries in human history. For centuries, Europe was shaped by war. Kingdoms rose and fell. Empires expanded. Borders moved constantly. Entire nations disappeared from the map and reappeared again under different names. From Napoleon to Hitler, from the Habsburgs to the Soviet Union, the continent seemed trapped in an endless cycle of conquest. And yet, in the middle of all this chaos, sat a small country surrounded by powerful neighbors, a country with no large army by great power standards, no colonies, no vast empire, and no access to the sea. A country that somehow survived. Today, Switzerland is associated with watches, chocolate, skiing resorts, and private banks. It is often portrayed as the peaceful heart of Europe, a neutral nation that simply stayed out of everybody else's conflicts. But that explanation raises an obvious question. If neutrality alone was enough to guarantee safety, why did so many other neutral countries get invaded throughout history? Why were treaties ignored? Why were borders crossed? Why were entire nations occupied despite promising not to take sides? And if Europe spent centuries proving that military power often mattered more than diplomatic promises, then why did Switzerland repeatedly avoid the fate that swallowed so many others? The mystery becomes even stranger when we look at the Second World War. By 1940, Nazi Germany had crushed Poland. Denmark fell in a matter of hours. Norway was occupied. Belgium collapsed. The Netherlands surrendered. France, one of the strongest military powers on earth, was defeated in just a few weeks. Almost every country around Switzerland had either been conquered or was under the influence of Berlin. The Swiss were effectively surrounded. On a map, their position looked hopeless. And yet Germany never invaded. Not because the idea never existed, not because Hitler respected Swiss neutrality, and certainly not because Switzerland was too important diplomatically. In fact, German military planners spent years studying exactly how an invasion could be carried out. They had maps. They had operational plans. They had estimates. They even had a name for the invasion: Operation Tannenbaum. The question was never whether Germany could attack Switzerland. The question was whether it was worth it. And that distinction changes everything, because the popular story says Switzerland survived because everybody respected its neutrality. The real story is far more interesting. Switzerland survived because it spent centuries turning itself into one of the most difficult countries on earth to conquer. Its greatest weapon was not diplomacy. It was fear. Fear of mountains. Fear of geography. Fear of resistance. And fear of a war that would cost far more than it was worth. To understand how Switzerland achieved something that almost no other European nation managed to do, we have to go back centuries before Hitler, before modern Europe, and before Switzerland became the peaceful country the world knows today. Because surprisingly, the story of Swiss neutrality begins not with peace, but with war. Long before Switzerland became famous for neutrality, it was known for something entirely different: war. Modern Switzerland often appears almost detached from the violent history of Europe. When people imagine the country today, they think of peaceful mountain villages, efficient trains, financial institutions, and some of the highest standards of living in the world. But if a traveler had visited the Swiss Alps 600 years ago, they would have encountered a society that looked very different. The early Swiss Confederation emerged in one of the most dangerous regions of medieval Europe. Powerful dynasties surrounded it. The Holy Roman Empire dominated much of Central Europe. Noble families competed constantly for land, influence, and control of important trade routes that crossed the Alps. For small mountain communities, survival was never guaranteed. The people living in these valleys quickly learned a lesson that would shape Swiss history for centuries. Nobody was coming to protect them. If they wanted freedom, they would have to defend it themselves. Throughout the late Middle Ages, Swiss fighters gained a reputation that spread across Europe. Again and again, armies from the Alpine cantons defeated forces that were larger, richer, and supposedly more powerful. The victories became legendary. One of the most famous came in 1315 at the Battle of Morgarten. According to historical accounts, Swiss fighters used the narrow mountain terrain to their advantage, ambushing Austrian forces and turning geography into a weapon. The lesson was simple but powerful. A smaller force that understood the landscape could defeat a much stronger enemy. Over time, this idea became part of Swiss military thinking. The mountains were not just scenery, they were a fortress. As Swiss influence expanded, another phenomenon appeared. Swiss soldiers became some of the most sought-after mercenaries in Europe. Kings wanted them. Dukes wanted them. Popes wanted them. Their discipline and effectiveness on the battlefield became famous across the continent. Thousands of Swiss men fought in foreign wars, often earning money and prestige far beyond what could be found in their isolated mountain communities. For a period of time, Swiss mercenaries were considered among the finest infantry forces in Europe. Their reputation became so strong that one small remnant of that tradition still survives today. The colorful guards who protect the Pope in Vatican City are descendants of the old Swiss military tradition. Yet success eventually created its own problem. As warfare evolved, Europe changed. Armies became larger. Weapons became deadlier. The political landscape became more complex. And then came a disaster that would alter Switzerland's future. In 1515, Swiss forces suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Marignano against the French. For generations, Swiss fighters had seemed nearly unstoppable. Now they faced a painful reality. Military glory carried enormous costs. The defeat did not instantly create Swiss neutrality, but it forced Swiss leaders to reconsider their place in Europe. Perhaps endless involvement in foreign wars was not the path to long-term survival. Perhaps security could be achieved in another way. Over the following centuries, Switzerland gradually began moving toward a different strategy. Instead of seeking influence abroad, it focused increasingly on protecting itself at home. Instead of conquering territory, it concentrated on making conquest difficult. Instead of projecting power across Europe, it began building a system designed around one objective: making sure nobody could easily control the Swiss mountains. The transformation was slow. It took generations. But by the time modern Europe began to emerge, Switzerland had already started developing the foundations of the strategy that would later make it famous. A strategy that depended on something stronger than diplomatic promises. A strategy built directly into the landscape itself. Because Switzerland possessed an advantage that no army, no treaty, and no political alliance could create: the Alps. And those mountains would eventually become one of the greatest defensive systems in human history. If Swiss neutrality has a symbol, it is not a flag. It is not a treaty. And it is certainly not a diplomatic agreement. It is the Alps. Stretching across much of the country, the Swiss Alps are among the most formidable natural barriers in Europe. To tourists, there are breathtaking landscapes filled with snow-covered peaks, lakes, and postcard-perfect villages. To military planners, however, they represent something very different: a nightmare. Throughout history, armies have generally preferred the same things: open terrain, reliable supply routes, and room to maneuver. Large military formations function best when they can move quickly, coordinate effectively, and maintain access to food, ammunition, and reinforcements. The Alps offer almost none of those advantages. Instead, they force invading armies into narrow valleys, predictable routes, mountain passes, and bottlenecks where even a relatively small defending force can create enormous problems. For centuries, Swiss military thinking revolved around a simple principle: if an enemy enters the mountains, make every kilometer painfully expensive. This was not merely theory. It became a national strategy. Swiss engineers spent generations studying their own terrain, identifying key roads, bridges, tunnels, and passes that any invading army would be forced to use. And then they prepared for war. Hidden throughout the country were defensive positions, artillery sites, ammunition depots, and military fortifications designed to turn the landscape itself into a weapon. Many of these structures were built so carefully into the mountains that outsiders often had no idea they existed. A peaceful-looking hillside might conceal artillery. A mountain cliff could hide defensive bunkers. An ordinary building might contain military infrastructure. Even today, visitors occasionally discover that seemingly harmless structures were designed with military purposes in mind. The goal was never to create an army capable of conquering Europe. The goal was to make conquering Switzerland so expensive that potential enemies would think twice. And this strategy became even more sophisticated during the 20th century. As Europe drifted toward another major conflict, Swiss military planners developed what became known as the National Redoubt. The concept was both simple and brilliant. If Switzerland could not defend every inch of its territory, it would not try. Instead, Swiss forces would retreat into the Alps, where the terrain overwhelmingly favored defenders. Critical infrastructure would be destroyed. Bridges would be blown up. Railway tunnels would be demolished. Mountain passes would become battlefields. An invading army might occupy cities in the lowlands, but controlling the country would become a completely different challenge. Because Switzerland's most important defenses would still remain intact inside the mountains. The message was clear. You may enter, but you will pay for every step. For military planners in Berlin, this created a difficult calculation. Conquering Switzerland was possible. Almost any country can be conquered if enough resources are committed. The real question was whether those resources would be worth spending. And increasingly, the answer seemed uncertain. A campaign through the Alps would be costly. Supply lines would be vulnerable. Terrain would heavily favor defenders. And every bridge, tunnel, and mountain pass represented another obstacle. At a time when Germany was already fighting across multiple fronts, the prospect of becoming trapped in a prolonged Alpine campaign was hardly attractive, especially when Switzerland offered relatively little strategic value compared to the enormous effort required to control it. But geography alone does not explain everything. After all, mountains can slow an invasion. They cannot stop one forever. The real strength of Switzerland came from something even more unusual. Because hidden behind the mountains was a society that had spent generations preparing itself for the possibility of war. And unlike many countries, the Swiss did not believe national defense was only the responsibility of soldiers. They believed it was the responsibility of everyone. When people think about military powers, Switzerland rarely comes to mind. The country has not fought a major war in centuries. It projects no global military influence, possesses no overseas territories, and is generally associated with diplomacy rather than force. On the surface, it appears to be one of the least militarized nations in Europe. But appearances can be deceptive. For much of modern history, Switzerland has operated according to a very unusual philosophy. Peace is best preserved by being prepared for war. Unlike many countries that rely primarily on a professional standing army, Switzerland developed a system based on the idea that national defense should involve the entire population. Military service became deeply integrated into society, creating a culture in which ordinary citizens were expected to play a role in protecting the country. For generations, most Swiss men underwent military training and remained part of a reserve force long after their active service ended. This meant that Switzerland did not need to maintain a massive army permanently under arms. Instead, it could rapidly mobilize hundreds of thousands of trained citizens if a crisis emerged. To outside observers, This created a strange contradiction. The country looked peaceful, but beneath that peaceful exterior was a population that had spent decades preparing for the possibility of invasion. And the preparations went far beyond military training. Throughout the 20th century, Switzerland invested heavily in civil defense infrastructure. Bunkers were built across the country on a scale that few other nations ever attempted. Entire generations grew up knowing where to go in the event of war. Underground shelters became part of everyday planning. Storage facilities were created. Emergency systems were developed. Even today, Switzerland possesses one of the most extensive networks of civilian shelters in the world. This was not paranoia. It was strategy. Swiss leaders understood that deterrence depends not only on weapons, but on perception. An enemy considering invasion should believe that victory would be difficult, expensive, and potentially endless. And the Swiss worked hard to create exactly that impression. Roads were designed with military considerations in mind. Critical bridges could be destroyed if necessary. Key tunnels contained demolition points. Important transportation routes could be rendered unusable within hours. The country's infrastructure was quietly designed to serve two purposes at once: support normal life during peace and complicate military operations during war. To many foreign observers, this seemed excessive. Why would a neutral country invest so heavily in preparations for a conflict it hoped never to fight? The Swiss answer was simple: because neutrality is only meaningful if you can defend it. History had taught them a lesson that many smaller countries learned too late. Declarations alone do not stop armies. Treaties do not always stop armies. Diplomatic promises do not always stop armies. Sometimes the only thing that stops an invasion is convincing your enemy that the cost will outweigh the reward. And by the 1930s, that lesson was about to be tested more severely than ever before. As Adolf Hitler rose to power and Germany began dismantling the European order, one country after another discovered that neutrality offered little protection against expansionist ambitions. Austria disappeared. Czechoslovakia was dismantled. Poland was invaded. Denmark fell. Norway fell. The Netherlands fell. Belgium fell. France fell. Each defeat reinforced a terrifying reality. Europe was changing rapidly, and military power was once again shaping the continent's future. For Switzerland, the danger was impossible to ignore. The country was surrounded by increasingly hostile forces. German influence expanded across Central Europe, while Italian fascism dominated the south. Neutrality suddenly looked far less secure than it had only a decade earlier. And yet, instead of abandoning their strategy, the Swiss doubled down on it. Mobilization plans were updated. Defensive positions were strengthened. The National Redoubt strategy became central to military planning. Every signal sent to Berlin carried the same message. Switzerland would fight, not because it expected to win a conventional war against Germany, but because it intended to make that war as painful as possible. And this created a dilemma for Hitler. Because while conquering Switzerland was certainly possible, defeating a determined enemy is not the same thing as benefiting from that victory. And in the middle of the Second World War, Germany had far more important priorities than getting trapped in the Alps. Yet the question remains: if Switzerland was surrounded, vulnerable, and strategically exposed, why did Hitler never pull the trigger? Why did Operation Tannenbaum remain a plan instead of becoming a reality? Because the answer had surprisingly little to do with Swiss neutrality, and everything to do with cold strategic calculation. By the summer of 1940, Switzerland found itself in an extraordinarily dangerous position. France had fallen. The Low Countries had been occupied. Germany dominated much of continental Europe. From a purely geographical perspective, Switzerland appeared trapped. Surrounded on nearly every side by Axis-controlled territory, it seemed only a matter of time before the country would share the fate of its neighbors. And yet, that moment never came. This is where the popular story often becomes misleading. Many people assume that Germany respected Swiss neutrality and therefore chose not to invade. But neutrality alone had never stopped Hitler before. Norway had been neutral. Belgium had been neutral. The Netherlands had been neutral. None of those declarations prevented invasion. Hitler was perfectly willing to ignore neutrality when it served German interests. So, if neutrality was not enough to save Switzerland, what was? The answer lies in a simple question that military planners constantly ask. What do we gain? Every invasion carries a cost. Soldiers must be deployed. Resources must be committed. Supply lines must be protected. Territory must be occupied and administered. No matter how powerful an army may be, war is always an investment. And like any investment, the expected return matters. From Germany's perspective, Switzerland presented an unusual problem. The costs were obvious. The benefits were not. Military planners understood that an invasion would not resemble the campaigns in Poland or France. The Swiss military had spent decades preparing specifically for this scenario. Bridges would be destroyed. Rail networks would be disrupted. Mountain passes would become defensive strongholds. Even if German forces succeeded in entering the country, maintaining control would be difficult. The Swiss had no intention of surrendering quietly. And perhaps more importantly, Germany was already fighting larger and more important wars. By 1941, Hitler's attention had shifted eastward toward the Soviet Union. The scale of Operation Barbarossa dwarfed almost every other military concern. Millions of soldiers were involved. Vast territories were being contested. Resources were desperately needed elsewhere. Against that backdrop, Switzerland began to look less like a strategic necessity and more like an expensive distraction. But there was another factor, one that is often overlooked. Switzerland was useful. Throughout the war, Switzerland occupied a unique position within Europe. Its banking system, financial institutions, and commercial networks provided services that remained valuable even to countries at war. Goods, information, and financial transactions could move through Switzerland in ways that benefited multiple sides. In other words, Switzerland offered Germany something that occupied territory could not always provide: cooperation without conquest. Why spend resources invading a country when you can often obtain what you need through economic influence and practical arrangements? This did not make Switzerland immune to pressure. Far from it. The country walked a difficult and morally complicated path throughout the war, constantly balancing survival against principle. Swiss leaders understood that they were operating in the shadow of one of the most powerful military machines in history. Every decision carried risks. Yet from Berlin's perspective, the situation remained unchanged. Invading Switzerland promised significant costs and uncertain rewards. Leaving it alone often seemed more practical. This is why Operation Tannenbaum never moved beyond the planning stage. The invasion remained possible. It simply never became necessary. And that distinction reveals something important about how small nations survive in a world dominated by larger powers. Switzerland did not remain independent because stronger countries suddenly became respectful of international norms. Nor did it survive because its neighbors admired neutrality. It survived because it managed to alter the calculation. The price of conquest became too high. The benefits became too low. And when those two conditions exist simultaneously, even powerful empires begin looking elsewhere. But perhaps the most fascinating part of the story is that Switzerland's survival was not merely the result of geography, military planning, or economic usefulness. It was the result of centuries of strategic thinking. A small country had carefully studied the realities of power and reached a conclusion that many larger nations failed to understand. Peace is not always protected by good intentions. Sometimes it is protected by making conflict undesirable. And that lesson remains surprisingly relevant today. Because modern Switzerland continues to be one of the few countries in Europe that has managed to maintain its independence, prosperity, and neutrality through some of the most turbulent centuries in human history. The question is not whether Switzerland was lucky. The question is whether Switzerland understood something about power that the rest of the world often forgets. Today, Switzerland is often presented as proof that a country can remain outside great power conflicts and still prosper. Looking at modern Switzerland, it is easy to understand why. The country consistently ranks among the wealthiest nations in the world. Its cities are safe, its institutions are stable, its political system enjoys a level of trust that many governments can only dream of. To outside observers, Switzerland often appears to have discovered a secret formula for avoiding the chaos that has repeatedly consumed the rest of Europe. But the reality is more complicated. Because neutrality is not a magic shield, and it never has been. Throughout its history, Switzerland has spent enormous amounts of time, money, and effort protecting the conditions that make neutrality possible. It built defenses, it trained citizens. It developed infrastructure designed for crisis. It cultivated economic importance. And perhaps, most importantly, it convinced potential enemies that attacking Switzerland would create more problems than it would solve. In other words, neutrality was never passive. It was active. It required planning, preparation, adaptation, and a clear understanding of how power works. This becomes especially interesting in the modern world. For much of the 20th century, neutrality seemed relatively easy to define. Countries were either aligned with one bloc or another. The dividing lines were visible. The rules, while imperfect, were generally understood. The 21st century is different. Economic systems are interconnected. Cyber attacks cross borders instantly. Information spreads globally within seconds. Financial markets react to conflicts occurring thousands of miles away. Modern crises rarely respect the traditional boundaries that once separated war from peace. As a result, neutrality has become increasingly difficult to maintain. Recent geopolitical tensions have forced Switzerland to confront questions that previous generations rarely faced. How neutral can a country remain in a world where finance, technology, energy, and security are deeply interconnected? Can neutrality survive when economic sanctions become political weapons? Can a nation stay outside a conflict when global pressure demands that everyone choose a side? These debates have become more prominent in recent years, and they reveal something important. Neutrality is not a destination. It is a balancing act, one that must constantly be adjusted as the world changes. Yet despite these challenges, Switzerland remains remarkably resilient. And perhaps that is because the country never misunderstood the true purpose of neutrality. The goal was never to make everyone like Switzerland. The goal was never to rely on the kindness of stronger nations. And the goal was certainly never to assume that conflict had disappeared from the world. The goal was survival. Everything else came later. For centuries, Switzerland studied the realities of power and reached a conclusion that many countries still struggle to accept. Peace is not simply the absence of war. Peace is something that must be protected, sometimes through diplomacy, sometimes through economics, sometimes through deterrence, and often through all three at the same time. That is why the story of Switzerland is not really a story about neutrality. It is a story about credibility. Because when Hitler looked at Switzerland, he did not see a peaceful nation. He saw mountains that would be difficult to cross, citizens prepared to resist, infrastructure designed to collapse around an invading army, a financial system that was more useful intact than occupied, and a country that had spent centuries preparing for exactly that moment. Switzerland was not protected because everyone respected its neutrality. Switzerland was protected because it made neutrality believable. And perhaps that is the real lesson. In international politics, principles matter. Treaties matter. Diplomacy matters. But in the end, nations survive when they can convince others that the cost of challenging them is simply too high. For Switzerland, that strategy has worked for centuries. And that is why, in a continent shaped by endless wars, revolutions, invasions, and empires, one small country in the Alps managed to remain standing.